Chapter 41. Just after the 7th morning gruel, two Tubob entered the barred room with an armload of clothes. One frightened man after another was unchained and shown how to put them on. One garment covered the waist and legs, a second the upper body. When Kunta put them on, his sores, which had begun to show signs of healing, immediately started itching. In a little while, he began to hear the sound of voices outside. Quickly, it grew louder and louder. Many Tubob were gathering, talking, laughing, not far beyond the barred window. Kunta and his mates sat in their Tubob clothes, gripped with terror at what was about to happen, whatever it might be. When the two Tubob returned, they quickly unchained and marched from the room 3 of the 5 black ones who had originally been there. All of them acted somehow as if this had happened to them enough times before that it no longer mattered. Then, within moments, there was a change in the Tubob sounds from outside. It grew much quieter. And then one Tubob began to shout. Struggling vainly to understand what was being said, Kunta listened uncomprehendingly to the strange cries. Fit as a fiddle, plenty of spirit in this buck. And at brief intervals, other Tubob would interrupt with loud exclamations. 350, 400, 5, and the first Tubob would shout, "Let's hear 6. Look at him, works like a mule." Kunta shuddered with fear, his face running with sweat, breath tight in his throat. When 4 Tubob came into the room, the first 2 plus 2 others, Kunta felt paralyzed. The new pair of Tubob stood just within the doorway, holding short clubs in one hand and small metal objects in the other. The other 2 moved along Kunta's side of the wall, unlocking the iron cuffs. When anyone cried out or scuffled, he was struck with a short, thick leather strap. Even so, when Kunta felt himself touched, he came up snarling with rage and terror. A blow against his head made it seem to explode. He felt only dimly a jerking at the chain on his cuffs. When his head began to clear, he was the first of a chained line of 6 men stumbling through a wide doorway out into the daylight. "Just picked out of the trees," the shouting one was standing on a low wooden platform with hundreds of other Tubobs massed before him. As they gaped and gestured, Kunta's nose recoiled from the thickness of their stink. He glimpsed a few black ones among the Tubob, but their faces seemed to be seeing nothing. 2 of them were holding in chains 2 of the black ones who had just been brought from the barred room. Now the shouting one began striding rapidly down the line of Kunta and his companions, his eyes appraising them from head to foot. Then he walked back up the line, thrusting the butt of his whip against their chests and bellies, all the while making his strange cries. "Bright as monkeys, can be trained for anything." Then back at the end of the line, he prodded Kunta roughly toward the raised platform. But Kunta couldn't move, except to tremble. It was as if his senses had deserted him. The whip's butt seared across the scabbing crust of his ulcerated buttocks, nearly collapsing under the pain. Kunta stumbled forward, and the Tubob clicked the free end of his chain into an iron thing. "Top prime, young and supple," the Tubob shouted. Kunta was already so numb with terror that he hardly noticed as the Tubob crowd moved in more closely around him. Then, with short sticks and whip butts, they were pushing apart his compressed lips to expose his clenched teeth, and with their bare hands prodding him all over, under his armpits, on his back, his chest, his genitals. Then some of those who had been inspecting Kunta began to step back and make strange cries. $300, $350. The shouting Toobab laughed scornfully. 500, 6. He sounded angry. This is a choice young... Do I hear 750? 750, came a shout. He repeated the cry several times, then shouted 8, until someone in the crowd shouted it back, and then, before he had a chance to speak again, someone else shouted 850. No other calls came. The shouting Toobab unlocked Kunta's chain and jerked him toward a Toobab who came stepping forward. Kunta felt an impulse to make his move right then, but he knew he would never make it, and anyway, he couldn't seem to move his legs. He saw a black one moving forward behind the Toobab to whom the shouter had handed his chain. Kunta's eyes entreated this black one, who had distinctly Wolof features. My brother, you come from my country. But the black one seemed not even to see Kunta as, jerking hard on the chain so that Kunta came stumbling after him, they began moving through the crowd. Some of the younger Toobab laughed, jeered, and poked at Kunta with sticks as they passed, but finally they left them behind and the black one stopped at a large box, sitting up off the ground on 4 wheels, behind one of those enormous donkey-like animals he had seen on his way here from the big canoe. With an angry sound, the black one grasped Kunta around the hips and boosted him up over the side and onto the floor of the box, where he crumpled into a heap, hearing the free end of his chain click again into something beneath a raised seat at the front end of the box behind the animal. 2 large sacks of what smelled like some kind of grain were piled near where Kunta lay. His eyes were shut tight. He felt as if he never wanted to see anything again, especially this hated black slatey. After what seemed a very long time, Kunta's nose told him that the Toobab had returned. The Toobab said something, and then he and the black one climbed onto the front seat, which squeaked under their weight. The black one made a quick sound and flicked a leather thong across the animal's back. Instantly it began pulling the rolling box ahead. Kunta was so dazed that for a while he didn't even hear the chain locked to his ankle cuff rattling against the floor of the box. He had no idea how far they had traveled when his next clear thought came, and he slit his eyes open far enough to study the chain at close range. Yes, it was smaller than the one that had bound him on the big canoe. If he collected his strength and sprang, would this one tear loose from the box? Kunta raised his eyes carefully to see the backs of the pair who sat ahead. The Toobab sitting stiffly at one end of the plank seat, the black one slouched at the other end. They both sat staring ahead as if they were unaware that they were sharing the same seat. Beneath it, somewhere in shadow, the chain seemed to be securely fastened. He decided that it was not yet time to jump. The odor of the grain sacks alongside him was overpowering, but he could also smell the Toobab and his black driver. And soon he smelled some other black people quite nearby. Without making a sound, Kunta inched his aching body upward against the rough side of the box, but he was afraid to lift his head over the side and didn't see them. As he lay back down, the Toobab turned his head around, and their eyes met. Kunta felt frozen and weak with fear, but the Toobab showed no expression and turned his back again a moment later. Emboldened by the two Bob's indifference, he sat up again, this time a little farther, when he heard a singing sound in the distance gradually growing louder. Not far ahead of them, he saw a two Bob seated on the back of another animal like the one pulling the rolling box. The two Bob held a coiled whip, and a chain from the animal was linked to the wrist cuffs of about 20 blacks, or most of them were black, some brown, walking in a line ahead of him. Quinta blinked and squinted to see better. Except for two fully clothed women, they were all men and all bare from the waist up, and they were singing with deep mournfulness. He listened very carefully to the words, but they made no sense whatever to him. As the rolling box slowly passed them, neither the blacks nor the two Bob so much as glanced in their direction, though they were close enough to touch. Most of their backs, Quinta saw, were crisscrossed with whip scars, some of them fresh, and he guessed at some of their tribes: Fula, Yoruba, Mauritanian, Wolof, Mandinka. Of those he was more certain than of the others, most of whom had had the misfortune to have two Bob for fathers. Beyond the blacks, as far as Quinta's runny eyes would let him see, there stretched vast fields of crops growing in different colors. Alongside the road was a field planted with what he recognized as maize. Just as it was back in Jafur after the harvest, the stalks were brown and stripped of ears. Soon afterward, the two Bob leaned over, took some bread and some kind of meat out of a sack beneath the seat, broke off a piece of each, and set them on the seat between him and the black one, who picked it up with the tip of his hat and began to eat. After a few moments, the black one turned in his seat, took a long look at Quinta, who was watching intently, and offered him a chunk of bread. He could smell it from where he lay, and the fragrance made his mouth water, but he turned his head away. The black one shrugged and popped it into his own mouth. Trying not to think about his hunger, Quinta looked out over the side of the box and saw, at the far end of a field, what appeared to be a small cluster of people bent over, seemingly at work. He thought they must be black, but they were too far away to be sure. He sniffed the air, trying to pick up their scent, but couldn't. As the sun was setting, the box passed another like it, going in the opposite direction, with a two Bob at the reins and 3 first Kafo black children riding behind him. Trudging in chains behind the box were 7 adult blacks, 4 men wearing ragged clothes and 3 women in coarse gowns. Quinta wondered why these were not also singing. Then he saw the deep despair on their faces as they flashed past. He wondered where two Bob was taking them. As the dusk deepened, small black bats began squeaking and darting jerkily here and there, just as they did in Africa. Quinta heard the two Bob say something to the black one, and before much longer the box turned off onto a small road. Quinta sat up and soon, in the distance, saw a large white house through the trees. His stomach clutched up. What in the name of Allah was to happen now? Was it here that he was going to be eaten? He slumped back down in the box and lay as if he were lifeless. Chapter 42. As the box rolled closer and closer to the house, Quinta began to smell, and then hear, more black people. Raising himself up on his elbows, he could just make out 3 figures in the early dusk as they approached the wagon. The first among them was swinging one of those small flames Kunta had become familiar with when the Tubob had come down into the dark hold of the big canoe. Only this one was enclosed in something clear and shiny rather than in metal. He had never seen anything like it before. It looked hard, but you could see through it as if it weren't there. He didn't have the chance to study it more closely, though, for the three blacks quickly stepped to one side as a new Tubob strode past them and up to the box, which promptly stopped beside him. The two Tubob greeted one another, and then one of the blacks held up the flame so that the Tubob in the box could see better as he climbed down to join the other one. They clasped hands warmly and then walked off together toward the house. Hope surged in Kunta. Would the black ones free him now? But he no sooner thought of it than the flame lit their faces as they stood looking at him over the sides of the wagon. They were laughing at him. What kind of blacks were these who looked down upon their own kind and worked as goats for the Tubob? Where had they come from? They looked as Africans looked, but clearly they were not of Africa. Then the one who had driven the rolling box clucked at the animal and snapped the thongs, and the box moved ahead. The other blacks walked alongside, still laughing, until it stopped again. Climbing down, the driver walked back and in the light of the flame jerked roughly at Kunta's chain, making threatening sounds as he unlocked it under the seat, and then gestured for Kunta to get out. Kunta fought down the impulse to leap for the throats of the four blacks. The odds were too high. His chance would come later. Every muscle in his body seemed to be screaming as he forced himself onto his knees and began to crab backward in the box. When he took too long to suit them, two of the blacks grabbed Kunta, hoisted him roughly over the side, and half dropped him onto the ground. A moment later, the driver had clicked the free end of Kunta's chain around a thick pole. As he lay there, flooded with pain, fear, and hatred, one of the blacks set before him two tin containers. In the light of the flame, Kunta could see that one was nearly filled with water, and the other held some strange-looking, strange-smelling food. Even so, the saliva ran in Kunta's mouth and down in his throat, but he didn't permit even his eyes to move. The black ones watching him laughed. Holding up the flame, the driver went over to the thick pole and lunged heavily against the lock chain, clearly for Kunta to see that it could not be broken. Then he pointed with his foot at the water and the food, making threatening sounds, and the others laughed again as the four of them walked away. Kunta lay there on the ground in the darkness, waiting for sleep to claim them, wherever they had gone. In his mind, he saw himself rearing up and surging desperately again and again against the chain, with all of the strength that he could muster, until it broke and he could escape too. Just then he smelled a dog approaching him and heard it curiously sniffing. Somehow he sensed that it was not his enemy, but then, as the dog came closer, he heard the sound of chewing and the click of teeth on the tin pan. Though he wouldn't have eaten it himself, Kunta leaped up in rage, snarling like a leopard. The dog raced away, and from a short distance started barking. Within a moment, a door had squeaked open nearby, and someone was running toward him with a flame. It was the driver, and Kunta sat staring with cold fury as the driver anxiously examined the chain around the base of the post, and then where the chain was attached to the iron cuff around Kunta's ankle. In the dim yellow light, Kunta saw the driver's expression of satisfaction at the empty food plate. With a hoarse grunt, he walked back to his hut, leaving Kunta in the darkness wishing that he could fasten his hands around the throat of the dog. After a while, Kunta groped around for the container of water and drank some of the contents, but it didn't make him feel any better. In fact, the strength felt drained from his body. It seemed as if he were only a shell. Abandoning the idea of breaking the chain, for now anyway, he felt as if Allah had turned his back. But why? What thing so terrible had he ever done? He tried to review everything of any significance that he had ever done, right or wrong, up to the morning when he was cutting a piece of wood to make himself a drum, and then, too late, heard a twig snap. It seemed to him that every time in his life when he had been punished, it had been because of carelessness and inattention. Kunta lay listening to the crickets, the whir of night birds, and the barking of distant dogs, and once to the sudden squeak of a mouse, then the crunch of its bones breaking in the mouth of an animal that had killed it. Every now and then he would tense up with the urge to run, but he knew that even if he were able to rip loose his chain, its rattling would swiftly awaken someone in the huts nearby. He lay this way with no thought of sleeping until the first streaks of dawn. Struggling as well as his aching limbs would let him into a kneeling position, he began his Subah prayer. As he was pressing his forehead against the earth, however, he lost his balance and almost fell over on his side. It made him furious to realize how weak he had become. As the eastern sky slowly brightened, Kunta reached again for the water container and drank what was left. Hardly had he finished it when approaching footsteps alerted him to the return of the 4 black men. Hurriedly, they hoisted Kunta back into the rolling box, which was driven to the large white house, where the 2 Bob was waiting to get onto the seat again. And before he knew it, they were back on the main road, headed in the same direction as before. For a time in the clearing day, Kunta lay staring vacantly at the chain rattling across the floor of the box to where it was locked under the seat. Then, for a while, he let his eyes bore with hatred at the backs of the 2 Bob and the black ahead. He wished he could kill them. He made himself remember that if he was to survive, having survived so much until now, that he must keep his senses collected. He must keep control of himself. He must make himself wait. He must not expend his energy until he knew that it was the right time. It was around mid-morning when Kunta heard what he knew instantly was a blacksmith pounding on metal. Lifting his head, Kunta strained his eyes to see and finally located the sound somewhere beyond a thick growth of trees they were passing. He saw that much forest had been freshly cut and stumps grubbed up, and in some places, as the rolling box lurched along, Kunta saw and smelled grayish smoke rising from where dry brush was being burned. He wondered if the 2 Bob were thus fertilizing the earth for the next season's crops, as it was done in Jafur. Next, in the distance ahead, he saw a small square hut beside the road. It seemed to be made of logs, and in a cleared plot of earth before it, a 2 Bob man was plodding behind a brown bullock. The 2 Bob's hands were pressing down hard against the curving handles of some large thing, pulled by the bullock that was tearing through the earth. As they came nearer, Kunta saw 2 more 2 Bob, pale and thin, squatting on their haunches under a tree. 3 equally skinny swine were rooting around them, and some chickens were pecking for food. In the hut's doorway stood a she 2 Bob with red hair. Then, dashing past her, came 3 small 2 Bob shouting and waving toward the rolling box. Catching sight of Kunta, they shrieked with laughter and pointed. He stared at them as if they were hyena cubs. They ran alongside the wagon for a good way before turning back, and Kunta lay realizing that he had seen with his own eyes an actual family of Tubob. Twice more, far from the road, Kunta saw large white Tubob houses similar to the one where the wagon had stopped the night before. Each was the height of 2 houses, as if one were on top of another. Each had in front of it a row of 3 or 4 huge white poles, as big around and almost as tall as trees. Nearby each was a group of small, dark huts where Kunta guessed the blacks lived, and surrounding each was a vastness of cotton fields, all of them recently harvested, flecked here and there with a tuft of white. Somewhere between these 2 great houses, the rolling box overtook a strange pair of people walking along the side of the road. At first, Kunta thought they were black, but as the wagon came closer, he saw that their skin was reddish-brown, and they had long black hair tied to hang down their backs like a rope, and they walked quickly, lightly in shoes and loincloths that seemed to be made of hide, and they carried bows and arrows. They weren't Tubob, yet they weren't of Africa either. They even smelled different. What sort of people were they? Neither one seemed to notice the rolling box as it went by, enveloping them in dust. As the sun began to set, Kunta turned his face toward the east, and by the time he had finished his silent evening prayer to Allah, dusk was gathering. He was getting so weak, after 2 days without accepting any of the food he had been offered, that he had to lie down limply in the bottom of the rolling box, hardly caring any more about what was happening around him. But Kunta managed to raise himself up again and look over the side when the box stopped a little later. Climbing down, the driver hung one of those lights against the side of the box, got back in his seat, and resumed the trip. After a long while, the Tubob spoke briefly, and the black one replied. It was the first time since they had started out that day that the 2 of them had exchanged a sound. Again the box stopped, and the driver got out and tossed some kind of coverlet to Kunta, who ignored it. Climbing back up onto the seat, the driver and the Tubob pulled coverlets over themselves and set out once again. Though he was soon shivering, Kunta refused to reach for the coverlet and draw it over him, not wishing to give them that satisfaction. They offer me cover, he thought, yet they keep me in chains, and my own people not only stand by and let it happen, but actually do the Tubob's dirty business for him. Kunta knew only that he must escape from this dreadful place, or die in the attempt. He dared not dream that he would ever see Jafur again, but if he did, he vowed that all of the Gambia would learn what the land of Tubob was really like. Kunta was nearly numb with cold when the rolling box turned suddenly off the main road and onto a bumpier and smaller one. Again he forced his aching body upward far enough to squint into the darkness, and there in the distance he saw the ghostly whiteness of another of the big houses. As on the previous night, the fear of what would befall him now coursed through Kunta as they pulled up in front of the house, but he couldn't even smell any signs of the Tubob or black ones he expected to greet them. When the box finally stopped, the Tubob on the seat ahead of him dropped to the ground with a grunt, bent and squatted down several times to uncramp his muscles, then spoke briefly to the driver with a gesture back at Kunta, and then walked away toward the big house. Still no other blacks had appeared, and as the rolling box creaked on ahead toward the nearby huts, Kunta lay in the back feigning indifference. But he was tense in every fiber. his pains forgotten, his nostrils detected the smell of other blacks nearby, and yet no one came outside. His hopes rose further. Stopping the box near the huts, the black one climbed heavily and clumsily to the ground and trudged over the nearest hut, the flame bobbing in his hand. As he pushed the door open, Kunta watched and waited, ready to spring for him to go inside, but instead he turned and came back to the box. Putting his hands under the seat, he unclicked Kunta's chain and held the loose end in one hand as he walked around to the back of the box. Yet something made Kunta still hold back. The black one jerked the chain sharply and barked something roughly to Kunta. As the black one stood watching carefully, Kunta struggled onto all fours, trying to look even weaker than he felt, and began crawling backward as slowly and clumsily as possible. As he had hoped, the black one lost patience, leaned close, and with one powerful arm levered Kunta up and over the end of the wagon, and his upraised knee helped to break Kunta's fall to the ground. At that instant, Kunta exploded upward, his hands clamping around the driver's big throat like the bone-cracking jaws of a hyena. The flame dropped to the ground as the black one lurched backward with a hoarse cry. Then he came storming back upright with his big hands pounding, tearing, and clawing at Kunta's face and forearms. But somehow Kunta found the strength to grip the throat even tighter as he twisted his body desperately to avoid the driver's club-like blows with thrashing fists, feet, and knees. Kunta's grip would not be broken until the black one finally stumbled backward and then down with a deep gurgling sound, and then went limp. Springing up, fearing above all another barking dog, Kunta slipped away like a shadow from the fallen driver and the overturned flame. He ran bent low, legs crashing through frosted stalks of cotton. His muscles, so long unused, screamed with pain, but the cold, rushing air felt good upon his skin, and he had to stop himself from whooping out loud with the pleasure of feeling so wildly free. Chapter 43. The thorny brambles and vines of the brush at the edge of the forest seemed to reach out and tear at Kunta's legs. Ripping them aside with his hands, he plunged on, stumbling and falling, picking himself up again, deeper and deeper into the forest, or so he thought, until the trees began to thin and he burst suddenly into more low brush. Ahead of him was another wide cotton field, and beyond it yet another big white house with small dark huts beside it. With shock and panic, Kunta sprang back into the woods, realizing that all he had done was cross a narrow stretch of forest that separated two great two-bob farms. Crouching behind a tree, he listened to the pounding of his heart and head, and began to feel a stinging in his hands, arms, and feet. Glancing down in the bright moonlight, he saw that they were cut and bleeding from the thorns, but what alarmed him more was that the moon was already down in the sky. It would soon be dawn. He knew that whatever he was going to do, he had little time to decide. Stumbling back into motion, Kunta knew after only a little while that his muscles would not carry him much farther. He must retreat into the thickest part of the forest he could find and hide there. So he went clawing his way back, sometimes on all fours, his feet and arms and legs tangling in the vines, until at last he found himself in a dense grove of trees. Though his lungs were threatening to burst, Kunta considered climbing one of them, but the softness of the thick carpeting of leaves under his feet told him that many of the tree's leaves had fallen off, which could make him easily seen, so that his best concealment would be on the ground. Crawling again, he settled finally, just as the sky began to lighten, in a place of deep undergrowth. Except for the wheeze of his own breath, everything was very still, and it reminded him of his long, lonely vigils guarding the groundnut fields with his faithful Wolo dog. It was just then that he heard in the distance the deep baying of a dog. Perhaps he had heard it only in his mind, he thought, snapping to alertness and straining his ears. But it came again, only now there were two of them. He didn't have much time. Kneeling toward the east, he prayed to Allah for deliverance, and just as he finished, the deep-throated baying came again, closer this time. Kunta decided it was best to stay hidden where he was, but when he heard the howling once again, closer still, just a few minutes later, it seemed that they knew exactly where he was, and his limbs wouldn't let him remain there a moment longer. Into the underbrush he crawled again, hunting for a deeper, even more secreted place. Every inch among the brambles, raking at his hands and knees, was torture, but with every cry from the dogs, he scrambled faster and faster. Yet the barking grew ever louder and closer, and Kunta was sure that he could hear now the shouting of men behind the dogs. He wasn't moving fast enough. Springing up, he began to run, stumbling through the brambles, as quickly and quietly as his exhaustion would permit. Almost immediately, he heard an explosion. The shock buckled his knees and sent him sprawling into a tangle of briars. The dogs were snarling at the very edge of the thicket now. Quivering in terror, Kunta could even smell them. A moment later, they were thrashing through the underbrush straight for him. Kunta made it up onto his knees just as the two dogs came crashing through the brush and leaped on him, yowling and slavering and snapping as they knocked him over, then sprang backward to lunge at him again. Snarling himself, Kunta fought wildly to fend them off, using his hands like claws while he tried to crab backward away from them. Then he heard the men shouting from the edge of the brush, and again there was an explosion, this time much louder. As the dogs relented somewhat in their attack, Kunta heard the men cursing and slashing through the brush with knives. Behind the growling dogs, he saw first the black one he had choked. He held a huge knife in one hand, a short club and a rope in the other, and he looked murderous. Kunta lay bleeding on his back, jaws clenched to keep from screaming, expecting to be chopped into bits. Then Kunta saw the two-bob who had brought him here appear behind the black one, his face reddish and sweating. Kunta waited for the flash and the explosion that he had learned on the big canoe could come from the fire stick that a second two-bob, one he hadn't seen before, pointed at him now. But it was the black one who now rushed forward furiously, raising his club when the chief two-bob shouted. The black one halted, and the two-bob shouted at the dogs, who drew farther back. Then the two-bob said something to the black one, who now moved forward, uncoiling his rope. A heavy blow to Kunta's head sent him into a merciful numbing shock. He was dimly aware of being trussed up so tightly that the rope bit into his already bleeding skin, then of being half lifted from among the brambles and made to walk. Whenever he lost his balance and fell down, a whip seared across his back. When they finally reached the forest's edge, Kunta saw 3 of the donkey-like animals tied near several trees. As they approached the animals, he tried to bolt away again, but a vicious yank on the free end of the rope sent him tumbling down, and earned him a kick in the ribs. Now the second two-bob, holding the rope, moved ahead of Kunta, jerking him stumbling toward a tree near where the animals were tied. The rope's free end was thrown over a lower limb, and the black one hauled on it until Kunta's feet barely touched the ground. The Chief Toobob's whistling whip began to lash against Kunta's back. He writhed under the pain, refusing to make any sound, but each blow felt as if it had torn him in half. Finally he began screaming, but the lashing went on. Kunta was hardly conscious when at last the whip stopped falling. He sensed vaguely that he was being lowered and crumpling onto the ground. Then that he was being lifted and draped across the back of one of the animals. Then he was aware of movement. The next thing Kunta knew, he had no idea how much time had passed. He was lying spread-eagled on his back in some kind of hut. A chain, he noticed, was attached to an iron cuff on each wrist and ankle, and the 4 chains were fixed to the base of 4 poles at the corners of the hut. Even the slightest movement brought such excruciating pain that for a long while he lay completely still, his face wet with sweat and his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. Without moving, he could see that a small, square, open space above him was admitting daylight. Out of the corner of his eye, he could see a recessed place in the wall, and within it a mostly burned log and some ashes. On the other side of the hut, he saw a wide, flat, lumpy thing of cloth on the floor, with corn shucks showing through its holes. He guessed it might be used as a bed. As dusk showed through the open space above him, Kunta heard, from very nearby, the blowing of a strange-sounding horn, and before much more time had passed, he heard the voices of what he smelled were many black people passing near where he was. Then he smelled food cooking. As his spasms of hunger mingled with the pounding in his head and the stabbing pains in his back and his thorn-cut arms and legs, he berated himself for not having waited for a better time to escape, as a trapped animal would have done. He should have first observed and learned more of this strange place and its pagan people. Kunta's eyes were closed when the hut's door squeaked open. He could smell the black one he had choked, who had helped to catch him. He lay still and pretended to be asleep, until a vicious kick in the ribs shot his eyes wide open. With a curse, the black one set something down just in front of Kunta's face, dropped a covering over his body, and went back out, slamming the door behind him. The smell of the food before him hurt Kunta's stomach almost as much as the pain in his back. Finally, he opened his eyes. There was some kind of mush and some kind of meat piled upon a flat, round tin, and a squat, round gourd of water beside it. His spread-eagled wrists made it impossible to pick them up, but both were close enough for him to reach with his mouth. Just as he was about to take a bite, Kunta smelled that the meat was the filthy swine, and the bile from his stomach came spewing up and onto the tin plate. Throughout the night, he lay drifting into and out of sleep, and wondering about these black ones who looked like Africans but ate pig. It meant that they were all strangers, or traitors to Allah. Silently, he begged Allah's forgiveness in advance if his lips would ever touch any swine without his realizing it, or even if he ever ate from any plate that any swine meat had ever been on. Soon after the dawn showed again through the square opening, Kunta heard the strange horn blow once more. Then came the smell of food cooking, and the voices of the black ones hurrying back and forth. Then the man he despised returned, bringing new food and water, but when he saw that Kunta had vomited over the untouched plate that was already there, he bent down with a string of angry curses and rubbed the contents into Kunta's face. Then he set the new food and water before him and left. Kunta told himself that he would choke the food down later. He was too sick even to think about it now. After a little while, he heard the door open again. This time he smelled the stench of Tubob. Kunta kept his eyes clamped shut, but when the Tubob muttered angrily, he feared another kick and opened them. He found himself staring up at the hated face of the Tubob who had brought him here. It was flushed with rage. The Tubob made cursing sounds and told him with threatening gestures that if he didn't eat the food, he would get more beating. Then the Tubob left. Kunta managed to move his left hand far enough for the fingers to scratch up a small mound of the hard dirt where the Tubob's foot had been. Pulling the dirt closer, Kunta pressed his eyes shut and appealed to the spirits of evil to curse forever the womb of the Tubob and his family. Chapter 44. Kunta had counted 4 days and 3 nights in the hut, and each night he had lain listening to the singing from the huts nearby, and feeling more African than he ever felt in his own village. What kind of black people they must be, he thought, to spend their time singing here in the land of the Tubob. He wondered how many of these strange black ones there were in all of Tubob land, those who didn't seem to know or care who or what they were. Kunta felt a special closeness to the sun each time it rose. He recalled what an old man who had been in Alcala had said down in the darkness of the big canoe. Each day's new sun will remind us that it rose in our Africa, which is the navel of the earth. Although he was spread-eagled by 4 chains, he had practiced until he had learned a way to inch forward or backward on his back and buttocks to study more closely the small but thick iron rings, like bracelets, that fastened the chains to the 4 poles at the hut's corners. The poles were about the size of his lower leg, and he knew there was no hope of his ever breaking one, or of pulling one from the hard-packed earth floor, for the upper ends went up through the hut's roof. With his eyes and then his fingers, Kunta carefully examined the small holes in the thick metal rings. He had seen his captors insert a narrow metal thing into these holes and turn them, making a click sound. When he shook one of the rings, it made the chain rattle, loud enough for someone to hear, so he gave that up. He tried putting one of the rings in his mouth and biting it as hard as he could. Finally, one of his teeth cracked, lancing pains through his head. Seeing some dirt preferable to that of the floor in order to make a fetish to the spirits, Kunta scraped out with his fingers a piece of the reddish, hardened mud chinking between the logs. Seeing short, black bristles within the mud, he inspected one curiously. When he realized that it was a hair from the filthy swine, he flung it away, along with the dirt, and wiped off the hand that had held it. On the 5th morning, the black one entered shortly after the wake-up horn had blown, and Kunta tautened when he saw that along with his usual short, flat club, the man carried 2 thick iron cuffs. Bending down, he locked each of Kunta's ankles within the cuffs, which were connected by a heavy chain. Only then did he unlock the 4 chains, one by one, that had kept Kunta spread-eagled. Free to move at last, Kunta couldn't stop himself from springing upward, only to be struck down by the black one's waiting fist. As Kunta began pushing himself back upward, a booted foot dug viciously into his ribs. Stumbling upward once again in agony and rage, he was knocked down even harder. He hadn't realized how much the days of lying on his back had sapped his strength, and he lay now fighting for breath as the Black One stood over him with an expression that told Kunta he would keep knocking him down until he learned who was the master. Now the Black One gestured roughly for Kunta to get up. When he couldn't raise his body even onto his hands and knees, the Black One jerked him to his feet with a curse and shoved him forward, the ankle cuffs forcing Kunta to hobble awkwardly. The full force of daylight in the doorway blinded him at first, but after a moment he began to make out a line of black people walking hastily nearby in single file, followed closely by a two-bob riding a hoss, as he had heard that strange animal called. Kunta knew from his smell that he was the one who had held the rope after Kunta had been trapped by the dogs. There were about 10 or 12 blacks, the women with red or white rags tied on their heads, most of the men and children wearing ragged straw hats, but a few were bareheaded, and as far as he could see, none of them wore a single saffy charm around their necks or arms. But some of the men carried what seemed to be long, stout knives, and the line seemed to be heading in the direction of the great fields. He thought that it must have been they whom he had heard at night doing all that singing. He felt nothing but contempt for them. Turning his blinking gaze, Kunta counted the huts they had come from. There were 10, including his own, all very small, like his. And they didn't have the stout look of the mud huts of his village, with their roofs of sweet-smelling thatch. They were arranged in rows of 5 each, positioned, Kunta noticed, so that whatever went on among the blacks living there could be seen from the big white house. Abruptly, the Black One began jabbing at Kunta's chest with his finger, then exclaiming, You, Toby." Kunta didn't understand, and his face showed it, so the Black One kept jabbing him and saying the same thing over and over. Slowly it dawned on Kunta that the Black One was attempting to make him understand something he was saying in the strange two-bob tongue. When Kunta continued to stare at him dumbly, the Black One began jabbing at his own chest. "Me, Samson," he exclaimed. "Samson." He moved his jabbing finger again to Kunta. "You, Toby. Massa say you name Toby." When what he meant began to sink in, it took all of Kunta's self-control to grip his flooding rage without any facial sign of the slightest understanding. He wanted to shout, "I am Kunta Kinte, first son of Amoro, who is the son of the holy man, Kairaba Kunta Kinte." Losing patience with Kunta's apparent stupidity, the Black One cursed, shrugged his shoulders, and led him hobbling into another hut, where he gestured for Kunta to wash himself in a large, wide tin tub that held some water. The Black One threw into the water a rag and a brown chunk of what Kunta's nose told him was something like the soap that Jafur women made of hot melted fat mixed with the lye of water dripped through wood ashes. The Black One watched, scowling, as Kunta took advantage of the opportunity to wash himself. When he was through, the Black One tossed to him some different two-bob garments to cover his chest and legs, then a frayed hat of yellowish straw, such as the others wore. How would these pagans fare under the heat of Africa's sun? Kunta wondered. The Black One led him next to still another hut. Inside, an old woman irritably banged down before Kunta a flat tin of food. He gulped down the thick gruel. and a bread resembling mungo cake, and washed down with some hot, brown, beefy-tasting broth from a gourd cup. Next they went to a narrow, cramped hut whose smell told of its use in advance. Pretending to pull down his lower garment, the black one hunched over a large hole cut into a plank seat and grunted heavily as if he were relieving himself. A small pile of corn cobs lay in the corner, and Kunta didn't know what to make of them, but he guessed that the black one's purpose was to demonstrate the two Bob's ways, of which he wished to learn all that he could, the better to escape. As the black one led him past the next few huts, they went by an old man seated in some strange chair. It was rocking slowly back and forth as he wove dried corn shucks into what Kunta guessed was a broom. Without looking up, the old man cast toward him a not unkindly glance, but Kunta ignored it coldly. Picking up one of the long, stout knives that Kunta had seen the others carrying, the black one motioned with his head toward the distant field, grunting and gesturing for Kunta to follow him. Hobbling along in the iron cuffs, which were chafing his ankles, Kunta could see in the field ahead that the females and the younger blacks were bending up and down, gathering and piling dried corn stalks behind the older men in front of them, who slashed down the stalks with swishing blows of their long knives. Most of the men's backs were bared and glistening with sweat. His eyes searched for any of the branding iron marks such as his back bore, but he saw only the scars that had been left by whips. The two Bob rode up on his hoss, exchanged words briefly with the black one, then fixed a threatening stare on Kunta as the black one gestured for his attention. Slashing down about a dozen corn stalks, the black one turned, bent, and made motions for Kunta to pick them up and pile them as the others were doing. The two Bob jerked his horse closer alongside Kunta, his whip cocked, and the scowl on his face making his intent clear if Kunta should refuse to obey. Enraged at his helplessness, Kunta bent down and picked up two of the corn stalks. Hesitating, he heard the black one's knife swishing ahead. Bending over again, he picked up two more corn stalks and two more. He could feel the stares of other black ones upon him from adjacent rows, and he could see the feet of the two Bob's horse. He could feel the relief of the other blacks, and at last the horse's feet moved away. Without raising his head, Kunta saw that the two Bob rode this way or that to wherever he saw someone who wasn't working swiftly enough to please him, and then with an angry shout, his lash would go cracking down across a back. Off in the distance, Kunta saw that there was a road. On it, a few times during the hot afternoon, through the sweat pouring down his forehead and stinging in the eyes, he caught glances of a lone rider on a horse, and twice he saw a wagon being drawn. Turning his head the other way, he could see the edge of the forest into which he had tried to escape, and from where he was piling the corn stalks now, he could see the forest's narrowness, which had helped him to get caught, because he had not realized that narrowness before. After a while, Kunta had to stop glancing in that direction, for the urge to spring up and bound toward those trees was almost irresistible. Each step he took, in any case, reminded him that he would never get 5 steps across the field wearing those iron hobbles. As he worked through the afternoon, Kunta decided that before he tried his next escape, he must find some kind of weapon to fight dogs and men with. No servant of Allah should ever fail to fight if he is attacked, he reminded himself. If it was dogs or men, wounded buffalo or hungry lions, no son of a Moro Kinti would ever entertain the thought of giving up. It was after sundown when the horn sounded once again. this time in the distance. As Kunta watched the other blacks hurrying into a line, he wished he could stop thinking of them as belonging to the tribes they resembled, for they were but unworthy pagans not fit to mingle with those who had come with him on the big canoe. But how stupid the Tubob must be to have those of Fulani blood, even such poor specimens as these, picking up corn stalks instead of tending cattle. Anyone knew that the Fulani were born to tend cattle, that indeed Fulani and cattle talked together. This thought was interrupted as the Tubob on his hoss cracked the whip to direct Kunta to the end of the line. As he obeyed, the squat, heavy woman at the end of the line took several quick steps forward, trying to get as far as possible from Kunta. He felt like spitting on her as they began to march, each hobbling step chafing at his ankles, which had been rubbed raw and were beginning to seep blood. Kunta heard some hounds barking far away. He shivered, remembering those that had tracked him and attacked him. Then his mind flashed a memory of how his own Wolo had died fighting the men who had captured him in Africa. Back in his hut, Kunta kneeled and touched his forehead to the hard dirt floor in the direction in which he knew the next sun would rise. He prayed for a long time to make up for the 2 prayers he had been unable to perform out in the field, which would certainly have been interrupted by a lash across his back from the Tubob who rode the hoss. After finishing his prayer, Kunta sat bolt upright and spoke softly for a while in the secret Sira Kango tongue, asking his ancestors to help him endure. Then, pressing between his fingers a pair of cock's feathers he had managed to pick up without being noticed while Samson had led him around that morning, he wondered when he would get the chance to steal a fresh egg. With the feathers of the cock and some finely crushed fresh eggshell, he would be able to prepare a powerful fetish to the spirits, whom he would ask to bless the dust where his last footsteps had touched in his village. If that dust was blessed, his footprints would one day reappear in Jaffur, where every man's footsteps were recognizable to his neighbors, and they would rejoice at this sign that Kunta Kinte was still alive, and that he would return safely to his village, some day. For the 1000th time he relived the nightmare of his capture. If only the cracking twig that alerted him had snapped a single footstep earlier, he could have leaped and snatched up his spear. Tears of rage came welling up into Kunta's eyes. It seemed to him that for moons without end, all that he had known was being tracked and attacked and captured and chained. No! He would not allow himself to act this way. After all, he was a man now, 17 reigns of age, too old to weep and wallow in self-pity. Wiping away the tears, he crawled onto his thin, lumpy mattress of dried corn shucks and tried to go to sleep. But all he could think of was the name Toby he had been given, and rage rose to him once more. Furiously, he kicked his legs in frustration, but the movement only gouged the iron cuffs deeper into his ankles, which made him cry again. Would he ever grow up to be a man like a Moro? He wondered if his father still thought of him, and if his mother had given to Lamin, Suwadu, and Madi the love that had been taken away from her when he was stolen. He thought of all of Jaffur, and of how he had never realized more than now how very deeply he loved his village. As it had often been on the big canoe, Kunta lay for half the night with scenes of Jaffur flashing through his mind, until he made himself shut his eyes, and finally sleep came. Chapter 45. With each passing day, the hobbles on his ankles made it more and more difficult and painful for Kunta to get around, but he kept on telling himself that the chances of gaining freedom depended upon continuing to force himself to do whatever was wanted of him, all behind a mask of complete blankness and stupidity. As he did so, his eyes, ears, and nose would miss nothing, no weapon he might use, no two-bob weakness he might exploit, until finally his captors were lulled into removing the cuffs. Then he would run away again. Soon after the conch horn blew each morning, Kunta would limp outside to watch as the strange black ones emerged from their huts, the sleepiness still in their faces, and splashed themselves with water from buckets drawn up in the well nearby. Missing the sound of the village women's pestles thumping the couscous for their family's morning meals, he would enter the hut of the old cooking woman and bolt down whatever she gave him, except for any filthy pork. As he ate each morning, his eyes would search the hut for a possible weapon he might take without being detected. But apart from the black utensils that hung on hooks above her fireplace, there were only the round, flat tin things upon which she gave him what he ate with his fingers. He had seen her eating with a slender metal object that had 3 or 4 closely spaced points to stab the food with. He wondered what it was, and thought that although it was small, it might be useful, if he could ever catch her eyes averted for a moment when the shiny object was within reach. One morning, as he was eating his gruel, watching as the cooking woman cut a piece of meat with a knife he hadn't seen before, and plotting what he would do with it if it were in his hands instead of hers, he heard a piercing squeal of agony from outside the hut. It was so close to his thoughts that he nearly jumped from his seat. Hobbling outside, he found the others already lined up for work, many of them still chewing the last bites of breakfast, lest they get a lashing for being late, while there on the ground beside them lay a swine, thrashing about with blood pulsing from its cut throat, as 2 black men lifted it into a steaming pot of water, then withdrew it and scraped off the hair. The swine's skin was the color of a two-bob, he noticed, as they suspended it by the heels, slit open its belly, and pulled out its insides. Kunta's nose stifled at the spreading smell of guts, and as he marched off with the others toward the fields, he had to suppress a shudder of revulsion at the thought of having to live among these pagan eaters of such a filthy animal. There was frost on the corn stalks every morning now, and a haziness hung low over the fields until the heat of the climbing sun would burn it away. Allah's powers never ceased to amaze Kunta, that even in a place as distant as this two-bob land was across the big water, Allah's sun and moon still rose and crossed the sky, though the sun was not so hot nor the moon so beautiful as in Jafur. It was only Allah's doing. It was only the people in this accursed place who seemed not of Allah's doing. The two-bob were inhuman, and as for the blacks, it was simply senseless to try to understand them. When the sun reached the middle of the sky, again the conch horn blew, signaling another lineup for the arrival of a wooden sled pulled by an animal similar to a horse, but more resembling a huge donkey, which Kunta had overheard being spoken of as a mule. Walking beside the sled was the old cooking woman, who proceeded to pass out flat cakes of bread and a gourd full of some kind of stew to each person in the line, who either stood or sat and gulped it down, then drank some water dipped from a barrel that was also on the sled. Every day, Kunta warily smelled the stew before tasting it, to make sure he didn't put any swine meat into his mouth, but it usually contained only vegetables and no meat that he could see or smell at all. He felt better about eating the bread, for he had seen some of the black women making corn into meal by beating it in a mortar with a pestle of stone, about as it was done in Africa, although Binta's pestle was made of wood. Some days they served foods Kunta knew of from his home, such as ground nuts, and kanjo, which was called okra, and soso, which was called black-eyed peas. And he saw how much these black ones loved the large fruit that he heard here being called watermelon. But he saw that Allah appeared to have denied these people the mangoes, the hearts of palm, the breadfruits, and so many of the other delicacies that grew almost anywhere one cared to look on the vines and trees and bushes in Africa. Every now and then the two Bab who had brought Kunta to this place, the one they called Massa, rode out into the fields when they were working, in his whitish straw hat. As he spoke to the two Bab field boss, he gestured with a long, slender, plaited leather switch, and Kunta noticed that the two Bab overseer grinned and shuffled almost as much as the blacks whenever he was around. Many such strange things happened each day, and Kunta would sit thinking about them back in his hut while he waited to find sleep. These black ones seemed to have no concern in their lives beyond pleasing the two Bab with his lashing whip. It sickened him to think how these black ones jumped about their work whenever they saw a two Bab, and how, if that two Bab spoke a word to them, they rushed to do whatever he told them to. Kunta couldn't fathom what had happened to so destroy their minds that they acted like goats and monkeys. Perhaps it was because they had been born in this place rather than in Africa, because the only home they had ever known were the two Bab's huts of logs, glued together with mud and swine bristles. These black ones had never known what it meant to sweat under the sun, not for two Bab masters, but for themselves and their own people. But no matter how long he stayed among them, Kunta vowed never to become like them, and each night his mind would go exploring again into ways to escape from this despised land. He couldn't keep from reviling himself almost nightly for his previous failure to get away. He couldn't help from reviling himself almost nightly for his previous failure to get away. Playing back in his mind what it had been like among the thorn bushes and the slavering dogs, he knew that he must have a better plan for the next time. First, he had to make himself a Safi charm to ensure safety and success. Then he must either find or make some kind of weapon. Even a sharpened stick could have speared through those dogs' bellies, he thought. And he could have been away again before the black one and the two Bab had been able to cut their way through the underbrush to where they had found him fighting off the dogs. Finally, he must acquaint himself with the surrounding countryside so that when he escaped again, he would know where to look for better hiding places. Though he often lay awake half the night, restless with such thoughts, Kunta always awoke before the first crowing of the cocks, which always aroused the other fowl. The birds in this place, he noticed, merely twittered and sang, nothing like the deafening squawks of great flocks of green parrots that had opened the mornings in Jafur. There didn't seem to be any parrots here, or monkeys either, which always began the day at home by chattering angrily in the trees overhead, breaking off sticks and hurling them to the ground at the people underneath. Nor had Kunta seen any goats here, a fact he found no less incredible than that these people kept swine in pens, pigs or hogs they called them, and even fed the filthy things. But the squealing of the swine, it seemed to Kunta, was no uglier than the language of the two Bab who so closely resembled them. He would have given anything to hear even a sentence of Mandinka, or any other African tongue. He missed his chain mates from the big canoe, even those who weren't Muslim, and he wondered what had happened to them, Where had they been taken? To other two-bob farms such as this one? Wherever they were they longing as he was to hear once again the sweetness of their own tongues, and yet feeling shut out and alone, as he did, because they knew nothing of the two-bob language? Kunta realized that he would have to learn something of this strange speech if he was ever to understand enough about the two-bob or his ways to escape from him. Without letting anyone know, he already recognized some words: pig, hog, watermelon, black-eyed peas, overseer, massa, and especially yes sir, massa, which was about the only thing he ever heard the black ones say to them. He had also heard the black ones describe the she-two-bob who lived with Massa in the big white house as the Missus. Once, from a distance, Kunta had glimpsed her, a bony creature the color of a toad's underbelly, as she walked around cutting off some flowers among the vines and bushes that grew alongside the big house. Most of the other two-bob words that Kunta heard still confused him, but behind his expressionless mask, he tried hard to make sense of them, and slowly he began to associate various sounds with certain objects and actions. But one sound in particular was extremely puzzling to him, though he heard it exclaimed over and over nearly every day by two-bob and blacks alike. What, he wondered, was a